By late August 1944, the military picture in Western Europe had turned decisively against Germany. After the Normandy landings in June 1944 and the breakout that followed, Allied armies were moving rapidly across France. Paris, occupied since June 1940, found itself at the edge of the advancing Allies, and the city's population was restive. The French resistance rose in mid-August, and barricades and street fighting erupted. Strategic priorities at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, known in French as SHAEF, under General Eisenhower, did not initially place Paris at the very top of objectives because Eisenhower's aim was to destroy German field armies and advance toward Germany. Politically and symbolically, however, Paris weighed enormous importance for France and for Allied morale. General de Gaulle pressed strongly for the liberation of the capital, fearing that a delayed entry would hand political advantage to the Americans or British and weaken French claims to sovereignty. The result was a complex political and military contest, played out in the streets of a city that still contained German garrisons and defensive plans. In that setting, Adolf Hitler sent what is frequently described as a last-ditch directive: Paris must not pass into the enemy's hands except as a field of ruins. This was part of a wider scorched earth posture in the late war months, when German high command issued orders to deny infrastructure and resources to the approaching enemy by destroying bridges, ports, and industrial facilities during retreats. The cable ordering Paris's destruction, known in French as Trümmerfeldbefehl, or sometimes simply quoted as "Paris must not leave us except in ruins," arrived as Allied columns reached the approaches to the city. The idea was simple in brutal logic. Even if you cannot hold an urban center, you can turn it into rubble, so that the enemy gains nothing and the retreating forces slow the advance. The political, cultural, and humanitarian consequences, though, were catastrophic if carried out for a great metropolis like Paris. How realistic was this order in technical terms? Destroying a major modern city is not a single deed. It is a series of engineering actions. Demolitions are typically planned around key choke points and infrastructure: bridges that connect urban islands to supply lines, main railway hubs that move men and materiel, major electric plants, pumping stations supplying clean water, and historic monuments that might act as navigation or morale signposts. Engineers would pre-place explosive charges in controlled locations, on bridge spans, under viaducts, at power plant supports, and then connect them to firing circuits. The Germans had already placed charges on many Parisian bridges and on other installations. Soldiers and engineers had surveyed and, in some cases, begun to prepare demolition charges in late August. Explosive charges ranged from demolition blocks placed beneath bridge bearings to sighted charges for key structures. The amount and placement determined whether a bridge would collapse intact, fail partially, or come down in a way that blocked navigation. The technical point is important. Demolition at this scale takes planning, materials, and control. It is not wholly a matter of a single wildly uttered order. The military disposition within Paris also mattered. When Dietrich Schultitz arrived as military governor in early August, he found only limited forces under his command. Estimates generally put the garrison around 20,000 troops, many of them second-line units, conscripts or otherwise not first-class formations. These troops were widely dispersed for internal security, and German communications and supply lines into the city were already fraying. At the same time, the French resistance had organized, and the Allied lines were closing in. That mix, a large, populated capital with many potential demolition points, a modest and increasingly demoralized garrison, and a near-immediate threat of encirclement, created a high-stakes decision environment for any German commander who received an eradication order from above. The question facing the commander of occupied Paris in the last days of August 1944 was thus both moral and practical. Could Paris be destroyed, and what cost, human, military, and political, would that impose on the retreating Germans?
Dietrich von Choltitz had been a career officer whose record included fighting across multiple fronts. Appointed military governor of Paris on 7 August 1944, he established headquarters at the Hôtel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli and found himself with the city in unrest and with limited forces to impose order. Over the next 2 weeks, the city's municipal authorities, church leaders, the Swedish consul Raoul Nordling, and members of the French Municipal Council, including Pierre Tatinière, engaged in intensive, frantic diplomacy to limit bloodshed and to persuade the German governor to avoid actions that would translate into wide-scale destruction and civilian massacre. Rallied by their politics and their sense of the city's cultural heritage, local leaders asked for restraint and attempted to secure guarantees for civilian safety. Choltitz met with these representatives on several occasions. It is sometimes tempting to turn those meetings into a simple moral parable: a German general with a conscience, an eloquent Swedish consul, and a noble decision to spare the city. The truth is more complex and structurally constrained. There are several overlapping explanations for why Paris was not destroyed that night by night after the issuance of Hitler's order. First, von Choltitz later argued in his memoirs that he simply refused to comply, believing that the order was militarily pointless and that Hitler had become irrational. He also emphasized personal admiration for Paris's cultural value. In his account, he weighed the military futility of urban annihilation against his role as a professional soldier and refused the order. Second, and equally important, the actual capacity to carry out the demolition across a city of 12 bridges and countless structures was limited by logistics, the quality of his troops, and the extent to which the resistance and Allied pressure had disrupted communications and movement. Third, intermediaries such as Raoul Nordling plausibly influenced the calculations, not necessarily by direct moral pleading alone, but by negotiating and stalling while the strategic picture changed. The upshot is that von Choltitz's decision to surrender on 25 August 1944 reflected a mixture of practical constraints, tactical realities, political calculations, and his personal judgment. Let us look at the technical, tactical, and human details in the hours before the surrender. German engineering units had sighted explosives on many of Paris's bridges and had plans to detonate them to prevent Allied use. If detonated in sequence, the bridges could have been rendered impassable for weeks, maybe months, denying river crossings and badly disrupting logistics. The preparatory work for such demolitions often included placing charges under critical spans and running detonating cables to a firing point. However, cables could be cut by resistance fighters, firing points could be overrun, and the flow of orders could be clog-stopped by the breakdown of communication networks. Several chronicles note that while explosives were in place at multiple sites, their wiring and firing systems were not always fully connected or were vulnerable to interruption. In short, the capacity to destroy Paris existed in partial elements, but it was far from a turnkey plan that could be executed instantly across the entire city under the chaotic circumstances of late August.
On the night of 24 August, as Allied armored elements approached and Free French forces prepared to enter, von Choltitz met with the Swedish consul Nordling for a long, tense negotiation. Accounts vary over the exact content, but they agree that Nordling pressed for preservation of life and cultural heritage, warned of reprisals, and reported on Allied positions and the practical consequences of demolition. Some dramatizations portray Nordling extracting a personal guarantee that von Choltitz would not destroy Paris or that he would not be held personally responsible. Historians remain cautious about assigning decisive moral influence to a single meeting. Negotiation and time-buying by municipal officials may have been strategically as important as ethical persuasion. In parallel, the French resistance and advancing Allied units were actively cutting lines and liberating positions, progressively reducing Choltitz's freedom to carry out citywide demolition. By the early hours of 25 August, the tactical balance had tilted. The Germans could no longer guarantee control of demolition circuits, and the value of destruction as a delaying tactic had decreased. Von Choltitz formally surrendered on 25 August to representatives of the Free French and allowed Allied troops to take control, thereby averting the wholesale destruction envisioned in Hitler's order. The story of von Choltitz in Paris is famous in part because it conveniently fits into several powerful narratives: the moral soldier who disobeyed a monstrous order, the cultural triumph of a city spared, and a turning point at which human agency saved heritage. But historians have also been careful to parse what happened into layers of motive, ability, and contingency. There are two central analytical questions. First, could von Choltitz realistically have carried out Hitler's order? And second, why exactly did he decide not to? Each question admits nuance. Could the order have been executed? Technically, parts of it could. Bridges already prepared with charges could have been exploded. Key installations could have been destroyed. If the Germans had maintained tightly controlled communications, and if they had dedicated engineering resources, significant damage could have been inflicted. But to carry out a citywide obliteration that crippled an enemy for months would have required centralized coordination, a steady chain of command, intact wiring for delayed or synchronous demolition, and the capacity to physically control firing points. By 23 to 25 August, the occupation apparatus in Paris was under severe strain. Resistance cells had cut lines. German units were short of reliable engineers and explosives in some quarters, and orders from Berlin were hard to enforce consistently. In effect, technical feasibility existed for targeted destruction, bridges, depots, but full, systematic annihilation of Paris as a functioning urban system was logistically fragile under the conditions that von Choltitz faced. That is a vital, often overlooked point. Moral culpability and practical possibility are distinct. Why didn't von Choltitz proceed? Here the evidence is contested, but converges on a multi-factor explanation: organizational incapacity, tactical futility, political calculation, and personal judgment. Von Choltitz himself emphasized that military reality rendered the order pointless. Destroying Paris would not have slowed the Allied advance in any decisive way, and would have risked mass civilian casualties and post-war consequences for the German officer corps. The practical inability to carry out the entire scheme added weight to his unwillingness. Moreover, surrendering to the French rather than continuing to fight may have been seen by von Choltitz as the best hope for fair treatment for his men and for himself after the war. Historians note that officers sometimes made such calculations as part of survival strategy. Finally, the interventions by municipal actors, Pierre Taittinger and Raoul Nordling, bought time, and time, in this case, was decisive. When the city's streets were contestable and demolition circuits uncertain, the order's lethality was blunted.
What makes the episode controversial among historians is precisely the mix of moral language and technical detail. Some scholars argue that the widely circulated narrative of a solitary gallant German general saving Paris by moral feat exaggerates the role of personal conscience and underplays structural constraints. They insist that the resistance's actions and the simple logistical impossibility of a total demolition were the real determinants. Others accept von Choltitz's account as substantially truthful in attributing a decisive role to his moral stance. The truth likely sits between. Von Choltitz cannot be exonerated of responsibility for his earlier wartime service, but on the specific question of destroying the city, he possessed both the authority and the discretion to refuse to execute the order, and he did so at a moment when doing nothing required both nerve and a calculation about the outcome. Comparisons sharpen understanding. Consider two contrasted phenomena: Rotterdam, May 1940, and Warsaw, September 1944. In Rotterdam, German air attack in May 1940 devastated the city. The episode shows what a concentrated bombing campaign and a commander's willingness to press the attack can do to an urban center. Warsaw's 1944 destruction, by contrast, included deliberate and systematic demolition by retreating German forces and reprisals against the population that amounted to a scorched earth policy carried out over months. Paris sits between these poles.
It might have been destroyed in part, but it was spared systematic ruin. The comparative lens highlights that the will to destroy, the technical capability to do so, and the political or military calculus to carry it out must coexist, and in Paris in August 1944, two of those three elements were compromised: technical capability and political utility, while the will was attenuated by the city's resistance and the shifting strategic balance. Numbers and technical detail help us grasp scale. Paris in 1944 had a pre-war population of roughly 2.8 million. Several hundred thousand had left during earlier occupation, but hundreds of thousands remained, and civilian casualties from indiscriminate destruction would have been immense. The German garrison, around 20,000 troops, was too small to control the entire city while wiring and guarding dozens of demolition points under conditions of civil insurrection. The resistance casualties in the fighting for Paris reached into the low thousands. Estimates vary. Many historians give a range of 800 to 1,500 resistance dead. The Allied casualties in the liberation were also non-trivial. Leclerc's division suffered dozens killed and hundreds wounded in urban fighting. These numbers emphasize that the human costs were immediate and visible. The potential further cost of wholesale demolition would have been catastrophic and long-term, affecting infrastructure, water, electricity, and transport in ways that would have haunted post-war recovery for years. Finally, the legacy is political as well as military. The sparing of Paris mattered strategically because it allowed France to re-establish its capital, its provisional government under de Gaulle, and to recenter the political narrative of liberation on French agency rather than on Allied imposition. It also produced a powerful symbolic story, that of a city saved from ruin, which has been retold in books and films and has shaped collective memory. At the same time, post-war interrogation of the archive has forced historians to keep the episode intellectually honest. Von Choltitz's memoirs and the dramatic accounts are only part of the story. The agency of the resistance, the tactical impossibility of a perfect destruction, and the fracturing of German command must all be included in any full explanation.